Whether you are Gen Z, a millennial, or a baby boomer, the United Methodist Insurance Program is here to help you plan, protect, and restore. Visit www.uminsure.org for a free rate quote today.
On our last episode, we featured the first half of my conversation with Pastor Jeremy Steele about reaching Gen Z. Well, today we pick up the conversation, including why Jeremy believes the United Methodist Church is uniquely positioned to make an impact with Generation Z. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. Every year, Beloit College puts out an interesting tool that they call the Mindset List, which they originally created to help their college professors understand the perspective of each year's incoming freshmen. This last year's list for the students that started in the fall of 2019 included items like, among those who have never been alive in their lifetimes are Princess Diana, Notorious B.I.G., Jacques Cousteau, and Mother Teresa. And even simple things like they've never licked a postage stamp. You can also do the same thing generationally. There are mindsets to generations. Going back to that Barna study, the biggest barrier of faith for non-Christian members of Gen Z is the problem of evil, with 29% of respondents naming this as a serious issue keeping them from faith. And you could say that they're still young and maybe they just haven't had the opportunity to learn the theology around this. Maybe not a lot of youth groups are doing problem of evil night. But you could also just look at the simple fact that 9/11 happened before most of them were born. And so essentially the world has been at war with terrorism for their entire conscious lives. And it's not all gloom and doom. Tech is a big part of their world. We've mentioned that before. That alternative title, iGen, is directly related to iPad, iPhone, iPod, all those things. They've essentially lived most of, if not all of their lives with smartphones, reliable Wi-Fi connections, and social media. Do you have any places that you turn to try to understand generational perspectives? I know that you produced a resource on millennials for MyCom. When you're doing generational research, what are some of the places or perspectives you try to find?
Well, I think my first go-to is Pew. And I say that because there's sort of a couple of different value sets that people who are researching begin from, doing these sort of statistical research on generations and that kind of stuff. And so Pew is an academic research firm that is really, so they're trying to find the trends. And so they, based on sort of just putting it out there and seeing what is there, right? And so that's why their generation dates are often random, seemingly random, right? Like 1996 instead of breaking it at an even year, because they see a reason in the just data that they've received for that moment. And so they have this sort of academic value, which is helpful, but they don't always ask the questions that you might want them to ask. Whereas, and so the other source the other sort of primary source for me, the places that I begin at Pew first, and then I go to Barna. And Barna is of this other school of researching. So they're a market research firm. Generally, they are being paid by somebody to research a generation in order to sell something to them.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, or to market to them in some way. So in fact, the United Methodist Church is actually contracted with Barna to ask some questions and find out some things that we wanted to know. And they're very helpful in that sense. But some of their research is sort of bent towards marketing towards people. And they also have a theological perspective, right? And so they are clearly Christian. And when you read through Barna research, you'll see sometimes a theological bent that I remember there was a list in one of their books where they listed where like a committed Christian would be in this like
some of their
list.
definitions. Yeah.
And I fell outside of that as a pastor. right? Though I do consider myself a committed Christian. But there's some theological perspective. So you just got to be aware of that when you're going into it. There's still really great data, fantastic data, but you just got to be a little bit more sensitive to like, how are they editing this based on the questions that they're asking and their theological perspective. Those are my two primary places. And then what I try to do is I find supplemental information that's done by other market research firms, other research organizations, that Beloit College kind of stuff that fills in gaps, but is in line with those two primary sources when I'm trying to begin this kind of thing. But I think Pew and Barnett is where you start.
That's great. And hopefully this becomes a resource for obviously those of you who are listening. We also have a great article on Resource UMC in the MyCom section, how to
Fantastic
reach
article.
Gen Z. And like we said, Jeremy produced a resource on millennials. And so we try to pull together and synthesize data. But if you're wanting to dig into it a little bit deeper, the way that Jeremy and I have done in preparation for things like this, Pew and Barna, again, with understanding where they're coming from and what they're trying to achieve, they offer some pretty solid data. Well, we talked earlier about social media, and basically, if you're looking to reach Gen Z on Facebook, you are gonna be out of luck. I heard on another podcast that if Gen Z is on Facebook at all, they view it more as the white pages. It's basically just a directory of people, and like if they cannot reach someone or find someone any other way, Facebook is sort of their last resort, and they're just there. Sometimes because they were required to have a Facebook Messenger, something for a class at some point.
Yeah.
But it's not where they are creating. It's not where they're sharing their lives. They're moving to platforms like Instagram, which even itself is kind of aging a bit. The new sensation right now is TikTok. And increasingly, we've seen more a shift towards direct messaging, small group apps, places where they can just text a small group of friends rather than posting, themselves to the world. This obviously it provides both opportunities and challenges for us as church communicators. What are your thoughts about harnessing social media as a tool to connect with Gen Z?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we talked about, and when we talked about millennials, is that we call millennials digital natives, that they've grown up in a digital world.
Right.
I call Gen Z social media natives, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they've grown up in a world where they have never been in relationships that weren't in some way mediated through social media. And that's an important distinction to make. You're right that the Facebook is one of the things, although when you survey them, Facebook is the most common thing that they all have. So, but they don't treat it as their like life diary or anything like that. They treat it exactly how you were saying. So they might see your Facebook page's post on Facebook, but that's not where they are going to do that. But they will go, if they're trying to check out your church, they will go to Facebook to find your church and look at your Facebook page, because again, Facebook is like the phone book to older generations. It's the place where you go to kind of find out the basic information that you need about people and organizations. Now, the other piece, though, is this sort of Instagram, in some ways, TikTok, yes, Snapchat, all of these sort of social media platforms that are high on one-to-one engagement. It is where they are. And you can spend all day long trying to make a value judgment as to whether or not you think Gen Z should be doing TikTok or should be doing Snapchat or any of that. But at the end of the day, that's where they are. And if you want to communicate with them, you're going to have to figure out how you engage in TikTok or Snapchat or whatever. And each of them has their own sort of peculiar risk factors. So, for example, Snapchat, the idea of disappearing message, which everybody is familiar with, but the real danger in Snapchat for organizations is that you can change your Snapchat username, right, to say like Jeremy Steele, right? So if somebody is screenshotting a message thread, it might have my name on it, but you might have put my name there. Right. And there's not a username visible in these screenshots that ties it to a specific account. And so it can appear that certain people are saying things that are not, or your organization is saying something that it's not. So
Mm,
there's some real risks in each of those platforms, but there's risk in every platform for your organization.
yeah.
And it's important for us to kind of be careful and intentional, but not avoid it. And that's where the opportunity comes from, because most churches right now are avoiding those platforms.
Right.
They do not have a Snapchat presence. They do not have a TikTok presence. And if you wade into those waters, you will be the only faith organization, most likely in your community, that has any presence on there, and which represents an incredible opportunity to build influence in your community amongst the Gen Z audience. So it's important for us to kind of just imagine what those things could be, and best way to do that is to get a group of people that include millennials, some boomers, some Gen X, and some Gen Z, and say, here's what we want to do. We want to get on TikTok. Okay, what are the things that we're concerned about, and how do we do it in a way that comes off as authentic? And the Gen Z people can help you understand the authenticity, what's weird, what's not, what's creepy,
Yeah.
and and then the older generations can help look for risk factors, what they are worried about if somebody from their generation is shown a screenshot or a video on TikTok by their grandchild. Like what like what would they be
Yeah.
concerned about
Yeah.
seeing, and all that kind of stuff. And especially with, when there's negative news about basically every social media platform every week, what sort of influence does the news cycle and the headlines as to what the danger is for this or that? What impact does that need to have on what we're doing?
Well, and I appreciate your recommendation that we be very intentional about it, because there's the one end of the spectrum of the don't touch it, it's super dangerous. There's the other end of I'm just going to jump in and try it and see what happens, and then suddenly you find
Let's make a
yourself.
church account and give it to a sixth grader. Go.
Yeah, and even in Florida, our children youth protection policy is slowly starting to catch up to the digital world,
Right.
but it's not fully there yet. It doesn't cover everything it needs to cover, and it doesn't maybe make youth pastors and volunteers and church staffs and even pastors aware of all of the things they need to be aware of. So definitely, proceed with intentionality and caution, but it definitely is. It definitely is a place of possibility.
And now a word from our sponsor. The youth of today will be the leaders of tomorrow. Generation Z has proven themselves to be socially conscious and passionate about improving the world around them. As Generation Z takes a more active role in the church, our hope is that they will not only continue the church's mission, but will also work hard to protect the church's assets. Ensuring that your church has appropriate insurance coverage is an important step toward that goal, and the United Methodist Insurance Program is here to help you plan, protect, and restore. With coverages ranging from property and casualty insurance to pastoral counseling insurance, UMIP can help you with your insurance needs. Interested in learning more? Visit www.uminsure.org for a free rate quote today. The United Methodist Insurance Program can help you protect your church today and for generations to come. And now back to our show.
The kind of last thing I'd love to ask you about is this age group grew up essentially during the Great Recession. So, like the millennials, we all graduated college, and some of us found a very difficult job market. Where for
Right.
Gen Z, it was kind of experiencing it through family stress with parents either losing jobs. They'd been loyal to a company or an industry for 20 years. They're maybe 5 or 10 years away from retirement, and suddenly they're gone. They're let go, they're downsized. They see their investments and retirement accounts just kind of collapse. Even in the Methodist Church in Florida, you notice the number of people retiring went down. And now that, the recovery sort of happening, you see
Hmm.
more and more folks retiring. And And so there's this mistrust of institutions in both millennials and Gen Z. And it makes me wonder, maybe we put a little too much effort in church communications on like slick branding,
Right.
churches with hip names and good looking logos. And even if it's not that, if your profile picture is a picture of your building or even just the cross and flame, that is the sign of an institution. And it
Right.
might sort of even subconsciously turn off Gen Z. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were about making our church marketing and communications more personal.
I think that's really the key. And I think Gen Z and millennials are hypersensitive to quality, right?
Yeah.
And compared to other generations. And so, but the quality is just that there's a threshold, right? It's like once you clear the like we are at a professional level of logo and layout and design. Like
Yeah.
once you get to that like that level, if you keep going too far down the road, it ends up into the like slick distrust marketing,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so what I think that we see is that when millennials and Gen Z, especially Gen Z, when they come to church, they are really needing relationship.
Mm.
Uh, the the good side about social media is that they can have relationships with people all over the world of all different like diverse backgrounds. Their kind of service level friend group has expanded astronomically,
Mm.
but because so many of their relationships and so much of their relational time is mediated through social media, it is they are starving for the sort of more full, immediate, face-to-face kind of in the flesh relationships. And so churches have exactly that to offer. I think that the idea of the incarnation, right? The idea of like being flesh to flesh, that God came and became fully human in the flesh, that powerful call to Gen Z, right? They want in the flesh. Now, because there's so much mediated, they don't always have as many skills
Right.
in that
Right.
area. And so there's some work to be done with churches in that side of it. But when you dial back to communication, if Gen Z are coming looking for relationships, then that means our communication, our identities, our branding needs to convey relationships. It needs to convey face to faceness, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and even when they're watching your service on the live stream, which I get,
Right.
it's not face to face, but they want to see that value. That value is something that they desire. And so one of the things that I serve a larger church, but one of the things that I say at the end of our service is I say, we're a big church, but we really are all about relationships because we believe that it's in our relationships that transformation really happens, right?
Mm.
And that's a very Methodist Wesleyan idea,
Right. Right.
right?
Exactly.
And but that's what they want to hear, right? And that's what they come here looking for. Whether or not they know exactly how to engage with it and all that, that's another discussion. But I think that you're right. When we think about like our profile image, when we think about like the header on our website, like or Facebook page, the header image on almost every church's Facebook page is an image of the outside of their building,
Right.
or somebody had a drone and they flew the drone up, and it's like
Yeah.
an aerial image of the outside of their building. But when
Come to our
somebody
church. We have the best roof ever.
right, can you see how tall our steeple is?
Yeah.
Right. But that's not what they're looking. What they're looking for is people. So in the pews during the time where you're passing the peace or whatever it is, that needs to be our identity. And what's interesting is it's the other piece that is happening is there's a lot of multi-site churches that the pastors are piped in via television, and a lot of
Right.
Methodist churches feel like they're in competition with a TV across or a video projector down the block. But that's also a uniqueness. So when they're looking for relationship, what we've heard multiple Gen Z people that have come to our church from those sort of churches or visited them and ended up landing here. They said, I want to know my pastor. They don't necessarily want to be best friends, but they want to be able to talk to the person who just preached a sermon. They want that person to pray for them. They want that person to visit them in the hospital. And in those multi-site churches, find ways to work around that. But ultimately, that is one level down of relationship that most United Methodist churches have in spades. And again, when we're talking about branding and marketing, it's a uniqueness that we can really lean into and say, a church of relationships, this is, come meet our pastor or whatever, right?
Yeah. Well, and the great thing about that is, if we offer that, that doesn't preclude them from listening to the famous pastor that
Right.
may
No,
be
totally.
piped into an auditorium down the street. Like they can still, even if we keep it within Methodist world, they
Right.
can still listen to Adam Hamilton, every Sunday, but then come and get to know Pastor Jeremy or Pastor Dan. And so
100%.
Yeah.
And they are already doing that, right? The people who are spiritually minded, they're listening to Adam Hamilton and Andy Stanley and Rob Bell or whoever it is, right? They're listening to whoever they like already, and like the sermon is very important, and that's an interesting thing with millennials. 40% say that they return to church because of the sermon, but you don't have to be the best communicator in the world, because most likely, unless you have a raging ego, that you're no Adam Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
You know that you're no Andy Stanley. You're never going to be that, right? And so just do your best, do good. It's meeting that threshold, and then lean into the relationship, right?
Right.
Make sure when that new person, that new Gen Z person shows up, you talk to them, you engage them in authentic conversation, and you follow up with them, not maybe on their doorstep, but with a DM on Twitter, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And say, hey, it was great to see you today. But that does mean that, when your visitor form might need to prioritize the Twitter handles over physical addresses, but that's a conversation for another day.
Absolutely. Well, that seems like a great place to stop. But Jeremy, we like to give all our guests the opportunity to offer any final words of encouragement or calls to action to our listeners.
Well, I think that I really do believe that the United Methodist theology is the exact right thing. It fits the millennials and Gen Z better even than it's fit any of the previous generations. Our understanding of prevenient grace, our understanding of science, our understanding of all the stuff that we've kind of talked about here is exactly what they're looking for. When you ask them, like, what are the problems? Our stance is almost always the solution to the theological problems they're looking for, which means we're poised to have really effective kingdom of God ministry in those generations. And to be completely honest, I think it's just a communication problem. Like, if they could know, and if we could communicate who we really were to them in an effective way, as I've seen over and over again, when they find that out, they're in, they're here, they're interested. And so I think that's both the encouragement and the call to action, right?
Awesome. Well, Jeremy, thanks so much for your time today on this supersized edition of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. And now, listeners, we want to hear from you. Between part 1 and part 2, what was most interesting to you? What was most impactful to you? And how do you plan on reaching and engaging Generation Z in your community? Email us at podcast@umcom.org, and we just might share your thoughts or stories or questions on a future episode. And you can, of course, always use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions for the show. We always love hearing from you. Finally, if you found this podcast to be helpful and you'd like to make sure other church communicators like yourself find this resource, the 2 biggest things you can do are share this episode with your friends and colleagues and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or whatever service you're listening to us on right now. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast.